And I think I'm going to go ahead and start the webinar. So welcome everybody to this webinar on working with students on an open textbook in a STEM discipline. I'll introduce Keith shortly, but I just wanted to say a few words about this Open Pedagogy webinar series, and happy Open Ed Week, everyone, and we'll have one each week. My name is Chris Price, by the way. I am the Academic Programs Manager for the SUNY Center for Professional Development. We're located in Syracuse, New York. And here's the schedule for the webinar series. You'll see a bit.ly link down at the bottom there if you'd like to register for any of the upcoming webinars. So we had our first webinar a couple weeks ago. That is there on that link. You can see the recording if you weren't able to attend that first one. And then we have one each day this week to celebrate Open Ed Week. And then we have a few others. And so, like I said, you can register for any of those at that link and then view recordings after the fact. So this, we're co-sponsoring this webinar series with the Open Ed Consortium. But just a few words about SUNY for those of you who are joining us from outside the SUNY system, the State University of New York system. We are a 64 campus system. Roughly half of our campuses are community colleges, and the other half are other 4 years and university centers. And there you can get a sense of where all our campuses are, pretty spread out all over the state. And so we rely heavily on events like webinars to keep everybody up to date and network and that sort of thing. So this particular series originated out of a Fact 2, which is the Faculty Advisory Council on Teaching Technology in SUNY. And there's a task force on open education initiatives. And one of the things that we're doing as a task force is sponsoring this webinar series. And so I will let Susan introduce the OEC, who's co-sponsoring this series. Susan?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Chris. We are super excited to be co-hosting these webinars this week, actually the whole series, but especially this week in recognition of Open Education Week, and so glad that everyone could join us today. Open Education Consortium consists of a member-based network that is literally worldwide with over 240 members. And we're involved in projects such as Open Education Week, OE Global coming up in November. And on the next slide, you'll see a link to some of our projects and events. Please look us up, join us, ping me if you have any questions. And at this time, Chris, I'll turn it back to you.
All right, thanks, Susan. Oh, here's the Open Ed Week. If you'd like to see other things going on for Open Ed Week, there's a slide.
Oh, so excited. After, I mean, I know we have webinars this week, but check out our schedule. We have a packed schedule of webinars and events happening literally all over the world. So thanks for that slide.
Sure. And so today we'll be hearing about, from, like I said, Keith Landa from Purchase College. So Keith has a number of titles. He's currently the acting director of the library, but his main gig, he's the director of the Teaching, Learning, and Technology Center at SUNY Purchase College. And he's also contributing faculty in the Environmental Studies Department. And he also is the Vice President Secretary of the SUNY University Faculty Senate. I've known Keith for a while. We collaborate a lot on faculty development initiatives throughout SUNY. And so when we were looking around for folks to do this, I thought of Keith immediately. I know he's doing a lot of good work with OER and Open Pedagogy with his students. And so this is our first in our sort of highlighting promising and best practices in Open Pedagogy. And so this webinar is only a half an hour, so Keith's going to talk about his project for about 15, 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions. So feel free to put your questions in the chat, and I will make sure Keith gets them by the end of the webinar. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let Keith share his.
Okay, thanks, Chris. So, promising. You set the bar for me, huh? So sorry for the long title, but I do want to talk a little bit, put my faculty hat on a little bit today and talk a little bit about what I've been doing with my students about an open textbook project as a way of thinking about open pedagogy. So So what I will do is basically just talk a little bit about some of the steps I'm taking to try to incorporate or involve my students in, to some extent, a bit of content creation and content curation, but please be aware that this is clearly a work in progress. So before I get started, I really want to thank Robin and Rajiv, who kicked off this webinar series, for the framework that they went through in their webinar. Won't go through all of the excellent points they made, but I just want to focus on a couple of points that did come out, and this will come up in a bit. But I mean, many of us come to open educational resources in general in terms of the high cost of textbooks and other materials for campus, for college, how that's contributing to students having trouble with access, how it's impacting student success measures in terms of how the number of courses they can take, how well they do in the courses, whether they get the textbook or not. That's a very important perspective from the student's perspective. I mean, I've talked with students about open educational resources, and a way to reduce costs is probably their number one interest in OER and open education. And from the administration's perspective, anything we can do to promote student access and retention and eventual graduation success, that's really what drives a lot of thinking about any kind of initiative from an administrative perspective. But putting my faculty hat on, really what is probably just as important to us is the ability for open educational resources to provide opportunities for us to think about opening up our courses and adopting various kinds of open pedagogy practices. And so, again, I really want to thank Robin and Rajiv for setting up this framework and going into all of the social justice and access issues that surround these. Also want to throw out give a little shout out to SUNY as well. SUNY, Chris mentioned a little bit about SUNY's organization, but for the last at least 3 years and probably further, SUNY has had various initiatives to help promote open resources, open textbooks, open educational resources. And we'll talk about some of those as we go through what I've done with my course. SUNY OER services and the open textbook projects have a variety of ready-to-adopt courses. They provide opportunities to faculty to take advantage of authoring and homework management platforms around open resources. And from my perspective as campus liaison for OER initiatives at Purchase, SUNY has been a very generous in funneling state funds to support open educational resource to the campuses to support course design and development projects to either adopt or build or create open educational resources. So with that, let me talk a little bit about my course and the and what I've been doing. So for the last, again, 3 years, I've been teaching the ENV 2720 Geology course for our environmental studies major. This is a required course. It's a sophomore level, although I get sophomores, juniors, and seniors taking it. Again, it is on a required course on the pathway. It's a combination, fairly typical lecture lab course, a couple of lecture sessions during the week, one lab. And in fall 2016, I inherited this course from a colleague of mine in environmental studies based on some changes we were doing in the department. I had a couple. Well, as I inherited this course, my colleague who taught it before had a couple of required texts because it was a lecture course and a lab course. There was a required text for the lecture, How Does Earth Work? There is a required text or lab manual, exercises in physical geology for the lab component of the course. And list price for these two together would be somewhere north of $250. At this time that I was taking over the course, SUNY was also beginning to promote heavily the option of developing open educational resources. And for a variety of reasons, I was interested in redesigning the course, not only to see if there were OER materials that could be used for the course, but also I wanted to kind of break down this lecture lab dichotomy in general anyway, and encourage develop much more of a field component. So here, the image on the right side of the screen is my students and I in the fall of 2016 on the top of Mount Higbee. By restructuring how I put lab and lecture together, I was able to develop these time blocks where we could actually incorporate a number of field trips. Because I figure the students are going to learn about rocks. Where's the best place for them to do that? It's sitting out on rocks out in the field. Okay. So I was looking for flexibility in how I could design the course. And I didn't want to really be locked into, well, here's the lecture text I have to use, here's the lab manual I need to use, and those are constraining how I think about the course. So I was right for a number of reasons to think about redesigning the course around open materials. Now, I was aware of the example that Robin presented in her part of the previous seminar in this series about how she had worked with her students to develop this open anthology of earlier American literature. And I won't go through all the details of this, but the short story is, she had an epiphany. Why have her students buy this expensive commercial anthology of earlier American literature when all those materials are basically public domain materials? So she worked with her students over a number of classes to develop all of the framework around those openly licensed materials to come up with their own open anthology of earlier American literature. So that's very exciting, but I thought probably not a good model for my geology course, since it's kind of a introductory level STEM course. I mean, typically there is there's going to be some textbook for the course in most cases, and it's not like we have a lot of public domain materials that we could pull together for this kind of anthology approach. However, there are increasingly many options for where you can look for various kinds of open resources, open text, and so forth. Lumen Learning up here in the top right has based on the Pressbooks platform, has a whole library of ready-to-adopt courses in their Candela platform. SUNY, as I mentioned, has a long history of providing grant support to faculty to develop open textbooks in various areas, and have partnered now with Lumen to make use of that Lumen platform. But there are many other places to look for open text as well. Many of you may be familiar with OpenStax. OpenStax has, again, a lot of the kind of introductory textbooks for a variety of fields, ready to go, ready to replace essentially the kind of commercial textbook that a faculty might adopt for a course. Open Textbook Library out of Minnesota, Open Ed from BC campus, British Columbia, MIT OpenCourseWare. Even if you're not even looking necessarily for an open text, there are learning object repositories like Merlot where you can go and find openly licensed material. So there is anymore, we are just kind of swimming in content, and the question is, what's the best constellation of content to use for my course? I actually looked through the Lumen platform that Open SUNY is collaborating with, and they did have a geology textbook, but in my estimation, it just wasn't quite ready for prime time. But by looking at these other places and a variety of other sources, I eventually settled on, in the fall of 2016, this suite of open texts and other open materials to use for my course. This physical geology text on the left here is actually a product from the BC Open program. British Columbia has put a lot of money into supporting faculty to develop open text, just as New York State has. And so there's a whole library, and there's a very nice physical geology text that came out of that. This laboratory manual for introductory geology, I think, has an interesting story. As far as I can tell, it used to be a commercially licensed lab manual for introductory geology, available from, I'm not sure which publisher, but for some reason, it's not the leading lab manual in geology anymore. It's now become openly licensed, and has all of the reuse, remix, redistribute capabilities that you would expect from these openly licensed materials. Earth and Space Science is a project from the high school earth science teachers out in Arizona, dealing with earth and space science. Not necessarily the most appropriate textbook for my course, but I thought it was a good complement because it covers the same topics that we would find in the physical geology text that was the primary text we're using from British Columbia, but at a different level with different kinds of examples. And so if any of my students were having difficulty with the materials in the physical geology text, they could use that as another approach. One other very interesting with the local tie-in example is this 10 to the 9th Years, a field guide to the geology of Westchester County, New York. For those of you who are not in New York or SUNY or part of SUNY, Purchase College is smack dab in the middle of Westchester County. And so here I came across this field guide to the geology of Westchester. I originally found it as a low print run volume that was available through interlibrary loan from someplace out, I forget where we got it from, but the faculty member who wrote it was actually a high school teacher in the area who, years before I came to Purchase, every summer would run a field camp for a geology field camp for earth science teachers in the area. And he has since opened license for this material, so it's available as well as this Geology 101, again, openly licensed from Wenatchee Valley College. So it basically was pulling together and adopting that kind of first step in resources, these materials for use in the course. From my students' perspective, they thought it was great that they didn't have to buy $250 worth of textbooks. And from my perspective, the main thing at this point was that I could be very flexible in how I develop my course, and I knew that I would have sources that I could draw on for the learning materials for any of the different sections I was developing for the course. There were some issues though. Again, as I mentioned, the physical geology course is the principal text that we were using, and it's the it's geared toward introductory or lower division college students. It has all of the topics that we would cover in our geology course. It's over 500 pages, the kind of textbook that you would expect for a science course. But if you look at it, for some reason, all of the examples deal with Western Canada. Okay, so in fact, there's a whole chapter, chapter 21 on geological history of Western Canada. And while I might find geology examples from Western Canada interesting, I figured that it might not be the most engaging for my students here in downstate in New York. So out of this came my idea for a project to involve my students in the development of materials for our course. I figured we could take all of these materials that we're drawing on, and I could work with my students to come up with a Purchase College Environmental Studies 2720 geology textbook that was customized both for the very specific topics that we were going to be covering in our course and customized for our local tri-state region, you know, having examples from New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. So I had a very simplistic idea. You know, each student would select a topic from the lecture, say sedimentary processes. They could curate the content from these variety of sources we were using. They would review them, remix them together in a new chapter, bring together materials from lecture, lab, and field materials, and then just edit that all for readability. And in terms of content creation, focus on coming up with local or regional examples that highlight the topics that we're covering. And ideally, maybe even develop some multimedia resources that would illuminate what's going on there. So that was the basic idea. I tried this fall 2017 and basically had very disappointing results. I essentially treated it as a replacement for the kind of term paper you would normally assign as more of a disposable kind of assignment. I told the students, here's what we're doing. You know, we want to curate and create materials on those topics. Each one of you do a chapter, write it up in a Word doc, give it to me. I'll collate them together and we'll publish this online, and done, we'll have our textbook for the course. I found students really had a very difficult time understanding this whole reuse, remix, redistribute idea. We have beaten into their heads so much, you can't plagiarize, you can't reuse, that it was very difficult. And so overall, the results in 2017 were very disappointing. I tried it again this last fall, better, but I think we still have a ways to go. Instead of having them write up Word documents, which is very much like how they would handle a term paper assignment, I used the Wiki Activity in our Moodle learning management system and gave each of them an individual Wiki Pages resource that they could develop. I think that helped to move the students out of their usual practice. They had basically this Wiki page that they were, you know, assembling materials onto and curating. We had very much more explicit discussion of what Creative Commons licensing means and what's involved in those OER 5 Rs, you know, reuse, remix, retain, redistribute, and so forth. And we also talked a little bit about, what we would expect to come out of this project. I won't go into the details given the time we've got here. I mean, here's just an example of Veronica's pages that she developed in the Wiki Activity. She was dealing with oceans and coastline. Just a couple of points. The materials presented in her voice, so it has much more of a student voice to it. She, to some extent, reused the openly licensed diagrams and images from the content material, but added her own. So these, this photo of Rockaway Beach and this Google Earth view of jetties. So she's bringing in local graphics and examples to take that material and highlight it for us. So just just want to go quickly through some of the student reflections that came out of this project. Again, I think it's really a work in process. But I won't take the time to go through this. I'll share these slides. You can look at them later. But this is a very good description of the kind of workflow that that I was hoping to get from the students. You know, reviewed the material, threw out what was confusing to me or didn't make sense. I put it all together. Then I had this flow problem, so I had to rewrite some things, and I searched for openly licensed images. And that's the kind of activities I was hoping to get from the students. Again, this idea of I struggled with copying the information for it felt like plagiarism, even though we had gone over this whole the affordances that come out of the open licensing and Creative Commons. But several of the students mentioned that it got them to think about how we present information, how we communicate science. There were the feeling that they were doing something that was more valuable than just writing a term paper that no one would see ever again. Some of the students, these reflections are basically from one of my, shall I say, less strong students, but he was able to bring in family experiences in the construction industry and talk about it in terms of some of the materials he was dealing with. And just this last reflection here, this student was able to bring in materials from her field notebook, and so was able to bring in experiences from other aspects of the course to tie into the open text. So again, that's kind of a work in progress. I don't know that it's necessarily, well, we'll just leave it at that. For my future plans, I'm expecting at this point not to do this student chapter rewrite approach again. I think I've gotten as much out of it as I can. What I plan to do is to take the materials that the students have curated over this last couple of years and put it together into a Pressbooks edition that I can share with my students. What I think I want to focus on going forward is more discrete opportunities for content creation on the part of my students. There's a lot of places where a little short YouTube video created by students explaining some of these topics could be embedded in our open text that would really help to enrich it. Again, to develop more text box kinds of materials that you would see in a regular textbook, rather than trying to rewrite and curate a whole chapter, to come up with very more concrete examples of, gravel resources in this area and how it reflects on some of the chapters. And I think for helping me out, I really want to get students writing the questions rather than just answering the questions. So with that, that's really a quick run through, and we've used up much of our time. But Chris, are there questions that people are interested in?
So no questions in the chat. So if anybody has any now, feel free to pop in the chat. If Keith, if you want to stick around past
sure
30 minutes, we can stick around. If anybody would prefer to ask their question of Keith, I can allow you to talk as well.
I would just say, I mean, if you're interested in this area, if you're interested in how open resources relates to opportunities for open pedagogy, there is this whole continuum that you can go through, or that you can help faculty go through, from just adopting materials versus how can they then involve students in the adaptation of those materials.
Yeah, someone said thanks for sharing the difficulties in the process, and I actually kind of thought that was really helpful to see. I think, a lot of times when folks are doing this kind of, changing their pedagogy or changing the way they do things, especially around content, that they, it's not going to go smoothly. It's going to be hard. It's going to be a process. And I think, so I appreciate that you shared that piece of it. It's
Well,
not going to work right out of the box.
no, I was really naive in the fall of 2017. I thought, well, each student gets a topic, they write up what they would normally write up, and we assemble it, and we've got a textbook. And no, that didn't happen at all.
So I don't see any questions. Oh, Nan has a question. I find it interesting that students had trouble with using the OER materials. What do you think we need to do differently to help students understand?
Well, there were a couple of different sources of misconceptions about the project that I had to kind of tease out from the students as we went along. The first I've kind of dealt with in that they were very uncomfortable reusing, remixing, and repurposing the materials, even though the materials were openly licensed to do that. It is, it is the culture that we inculcate all the way through middle school, high school, and into college, that you have to cite, you have to, and I'm not saying we don't do that anymore, but it is a different approach to materials when we're dealing with these different kinds of licensing. And the ability to take the openly licensed material, add value to it, and share it back out to the community is perhaps a perspective we want to promote a little bit more academically. I mean, students are probably very savvy in terms of remix culture when it comes to popular media, but they just don't think of it in terms of academic materials. Later on, after I really covered the Creative Commons licensing and all of these rights to reuse and remix and so forth, I got kind of the opposite misconception among my students. In the fall 2018 project, they felt like they could only use openly licensed materials. They could, and it was, you have to figure out how to say, no, we can reuse and remix things that are openly licensed, but we can still reference and bring in non-openly licensed materials the same way you would normally do through a regular kind of academic paper approach.
So the next question is, did you collect everything on Moodle or did you use a different platform?
I collected everything in Moodle. Fall 2017 basically collected their either Word docs or PDFs that they put together into a Moodle assignment. And so I've got those for raw materials for remixing as well. As I said, in fall 18, I actually used the Wiki Activity and have them create or curate the materials in resource pages in Moodle. So that's all there. And I did have them do a reflection assignment where I asked them some basic reflection prompts. What was your process like? What were your difficulties? How does this differ from other kinds of activities? And I've just kind of pulled not random, but illustrative examples from those comments. I really only have about a dozen reflection paper submissions, so I don't know that I'll ever really do a kind of a formal item analysis, but I thought there were interesting reflections that came out of that.
And one more question, and we'll end for today. And are you going to make a book out of the OER materials you have gathered? Or are you going to be using the college bookstore to go through the process?
Well, my plan is to use the Pressbooks platform. I do have an account at pressbooks.com. I got mine in before they before they locked it down a little bit to keep out some of the spammers. So my plan is to use that, add in some of the annotation tools that are available to allow students to actually comment on the materials, and use that as a place where we can also collect some of these maybe multimedia resources that I might have students work on going forward. Those materials can be exported in a variety of different formats. You can download them as EPUB if students want to read them on their Kindles or Kindle app on their iPads. They can be downloaded as PDFs to be taken to either the bookstore or to some print on demand if students wanted to have a hard copy. I must say that over the 3 years that we've used these open materials, none of my students have had a big push to say, can I print this out as a book? So I know that is an issue in some student populations, in some regions, but it doesn't seem to be a big issue for my students here.
And then one thing I just want to share before we go is there was a comment that from Vahid says, I heard once that the process of remixing plus remixing described as remixing with a chainsaw because how brutal it felt to the speaker. So anyway, thanks so much, Keith. It was really, really cool. And we'll get the recording up on the website for the series shortly. I want to say tomorrow there's actually a panel, an hour-long panel on open pedagogy with a number of folks from actually some Cape Town, South Africa. So check that out if you can be there tomorrow. You can register on our website. And thanks again, Keith. This was great. All right. Stop recording somehow.